Our menu for today, let us begin for the first plenary sessions on polarization and its discontent in the Global South. Now I invite my teacher, Dr. Diki Sofyan, as Honorable Core Faculty of ICRS, as our host for today's sessions. And the first session will be hosted by Dr. Diki Sofyan. Please, you may take the stage.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you all. I'd like to invite all of the invitees for this talk show. And one of the reasons why we're calling this a talk show is that we're not going to be too serious and we're not going to be too pedantic or academic in that sense. I would like to invite the first speaker, Daniel Medina from IFIT, from the Institute for Integrated Transition, based in Colombia. Please. And the next one we have Ms. Ana Carolina Evangelista from ICER, the Institute for Studies on Religion from Brazil. Next one, I'd like to call Nicholas Adams from Birmingham University. And last but not least, we have Ms. Nurhuda Ramli from Iman Research, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So we have about 1 hour, 15 minutes, basically, to discuss polarization and its discontent in the Global South. And we have here with us scholars, activists, and researchers who have been looking at the phenomenon of polarization, both in their own context and country, but also in other contexts and countries. And as we know, polarization is this very elusive phenomenon, yeah? And I have a number of questions which I will try to field to them and try to pick their brains, yeah? And one of the things that we all realize is that there is no clear definition of polarization. I mean, people have different notions of polarization. And it seems like if you ask 2 people, you'll get like 4 definitions. If you ask 5 people, you'll get like 7 or 8 definitions of polarization. So I'd like to ask the panelists, I mean, what's your definition of polarization? And how do you define it? How can we conceive of this idea of polarization? I mean, we know it's not radicalization. We know it's not social disintegration. So what is it? What is polarization? Maybe I'll start with Daniel. Would you like to take up the mic?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I come from a really long place. I had a really long trip from Colombia, South America, in order just to answer this question. For 3 years at IFIT, at the Institute for Integrated Transitions, we have trying to understand what polarization is. This is a work that we have done in partnership with the Ford Foundation. And we agree with you, Diki, that this is a really young field, a field that still needs for conceptual development, first of all, and a field that it's just growing and developing in general. But in order to be provocative, we have defined, or not defined, we have put polarization in a special category. And we have said that polarization is a hyper problem. What does that mean? A hyper problem is a special category of problem that makes any other problem or conflict more difficult to solve, to transform, or to deal with. That's an initial, like, kind of conceptual definition. Why does it make it more difficult to other problems to be transformed? As it creates social immobility. It doesn't allow people to find understanding, to find cooperation, to build bridges between them. So it creates social immobility, and that's why it creates more difficulties to deal with problems in general. But we wanted to go a little bit further with that. And I believe that this is the right moment maybe to propose a definition that I hope gets a lot of criticism, constructive criticism among you in these 2 days that we will be discussing. And in IFIT, we have defined so far, and this is a working definition, I have to say, polarization as a prominent division or conflict that forms between major groups in a society or political system, and that it's marked by clustering and radicalization of views and beliefs at two distant and antagonic poles. That's a working definition, and that's where we are standing at this point, considering and recognizing, of course, that this is a working definition, our definition that's still developing, and I hope to receive all your constructive reflections on this definition that I just shared with you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And we know that Colombia is a highly polarized society. They have 6 elaborate. But I'd like to invite Anna from Brazil. How do you define polarization? What is polarization and what is not polarization?
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for having me here and for having us from the Institute of Studies on Religion from Brazil. I also came very far to be here, and it's my first time in Indonesia, so I'm really glad I'm here. Yeah, my first trip, and I'm willing to come back. We have a lot of things in common, especially the institute and the work ICRS do here. So I want to thank very much Dr. Zainal and Diki for the invitation. I'm glad you have a definition, Daniel. I think I'm gonna dialogue a little bit about that. In Brazil, at the Institute, we don't necessarily focus on the concept of polarization. We are a secular NGO doing research and field work with religious groups, the diversity of religious groups in Brazil, for 53 years already. And more recently, we work with the concept of polarization. The concept of polarization in Brazilian society is kind of new in a sense of because of the radicalization in politics. So I dialogue with that. So I was coming here and I read two headlines in the airport. One was about the Pope that had passed, and the headline said in Financial Times, "Modernize the Pontiff," about the Pope, "in an era of populism and polarization." I would never think about seeing a headline about the Pope using the word polarization. So it's new, it's hyper, and it's new for us to think about. Another headline was at Foreign Affairs, the cover of Foreign Affairs, a well-known academic magazine, a North American magazine. The cover of Foreign Affairs, the new issue is "The Center Will Not Hold." So I was thinking about those two headlines in order to try to answer the questions that Diki posed us. Why is so difficult to define it? First of all, to have different ideas, to have even different poles or different spectrums to analyze something, to have different opinions, even opposed opinions, is part of life and is part of democratic world and construction. So that's what it is really new for Brazilians in order to deal with only the strict concept of polarization, because we always had different parties, different political parties, different ideas in constructing politics and democracy in Brazil. not necessarily the way in the middle or not necessarily the center will be the only legitimate answer or way to go, right? I think we can agree with that. But at the same time, we've been witnessing a greater and stronger radicalization of the poles. Let's use the concept poles here, okay? So poles trying to be more absolute in itself as closed shells or closed bubbles, less flexible, less open to whatever it's outside the pole. And not only radicalization of different poles, any way we define it, but a radicalization on the ways we deal with these different poles or opinions or ways to see the world. So especially, I want to stress this concept to pass to my colleague here, especially political radicalization that includes greater intolerance to diversity or to what is different from me. And we are seeing this a lot in Brazilian politics right now, especially influenced by specific use of religion. I will talk about that later. And also a political radicalization that includes extremist discourses as a way of facing social and economic crisis. So when I go back to the headlines, polarization and the center will not hold, I'm also talking about that. Why it's hypered and why it's so different. It's a concept that comes along different dimensions in order to deal with that. So yes. just to start.
Thank you very much, Anna. And Nick, you are living in Birmingham, and you were telling me last year when I visited Birmingham, you've got 30% Muslims living in Birmingham. Can you imagine that? You know, in a city in the UK. And lately we've seen a lot of protests and people fighting on the streets, with rightists and white supremacists against perhaps the Asian migrants and others. So how do you define polarization? Is that polarization, or is polarization something else?
Salam alaikum, salam al-pagi. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Padiki, to Pazain. Thank you very much to the interpreter, arguably the most important person. And thank you so many students who are here. Before I say a little bit about polarization, I want to just echo the comments made by Ibu Mahama about the Centre and ICRS. To be a top 50 institution in the QS rankings means this is not just one of the most significant centres in Java or in Indonesia or in ASEAN. You're one of the most significant in the world. So thank you very much for inviting us to be part of that. You're going to see a lot of folk coming through Jogja as a consequence. I am a philosopher of interreligious engagement, and the job of philosophers is to make distinctions that matter. So I just want to make a very brief distinction, a very common one in anthropology, between things which are found, so things that you encounter in the world, and things that are made, things that are fabricated, produced by humans. So found things, volcanoes, stones, made things, cities, universities, research centres like ICRS. So my first question then is polarization something which we find? Is it something found in the world? Or is it something that is made? And I think as soon as that question is asked, whether we're asking that in Jogja or asking it in Birmingham, where I am. So Birmingham's a smallish European city, 2.2 million people, 30% Muslim. Now, what does that mean in Birmingham? It means many different languages, not just one language. 30% Christian, which would mean Catholic and Protestant in Britain. 10% Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, and other religious traditions. And this is the most remarkable figure. Only 30% of the population of Birmingham at our last census said I am not religious. Only 30%. That's very, very unusual in a European city. Having introduced the distinction between things which are found and things that are made, I'm imagining, in your imagination, already you're beginning to think, oh, this is something created, this is made. And so I want to introduce a Latin phrase, which is going to be very important for me over the 2 days of our discussion. And those two Latin words are cui bono, which translated into English and about to be translated into Bahasa Indonesia, who benefits. So if we are in a situation of polarization, Carolina also already mentioned that there are newspaper headlines connecting this with Pope Francis. If we are in a world of polarization, who benefits? And I suppose the first thing to say is not us, not students, not university researchers. This is an area where there are real gains to be made politically by actors who we should not trust. So who benefits from talking about polarization and increasing it? Birmingham, the most super diverse city of that size in Europe, is not a polarized city. If you were to go today and walk around Birmingham and say, what is the most important issue in our city, and you can look this up in newspapers, you would discover that the issue is not religious diversity, it is not polarization between different religious groups. The main issue is that the men who collect our rubbish have been on strike since January, and our streets are awash with rubbish and rats. Now that's a problem which we want to solve. Our council and our political leadership is a mixture of Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, and they're all trying to work together. But they're not trying to work together for religious peace in the city. They're trying to work together to end a strike by rubbish bin collectors. And I think it's really important as we think about religious polarization and diversity, that it's these sorts of local issues actually which matter to us, and that forms of cooperation between different religious groups in cities like Birmingham are the only way in which we can work together. So I would say the first thing is this a category which is made or found, and that we should be suspicious that it is a made category? And then second, to ask the critical question, cui bono? Who is benefiting from this category? And how then do we work in order to ease some of these difficulties? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. Now we go to Malaysia, and as we all know, in Malaysia, the ethnic and religious identities are inextricably linked. Yeah? And Malaysia has always prided itself as being truly Asia, but we have also seen sharp polarization among ethnic and religious groups. So how do you see polarization, and how does it play out in Malaysia? Nur Huda, please.
So coming from a country where is a former colony of the British imperialism, which the blueprint of Malaysian society is always, divide and rule, which means that Malay, Indian, and Chinese ethnic communities are, being situated in different places. So that's already a fertile land for polarization. That's number one. Number two, the blueprint I think that is an elephant in the room that a lot of people do not want to talk about is the Islamization projects that happened back then in the 1980s. Before that, we have this new economic policy, but in the 1960s, 1970s by the second Prime Minister, Tun Abdul Razak, which actually to alleviate the Malay communities to living better economically is an affirmative action.
But somehow, because of, when we move forward, this affirmative action did not, being improvised to a better form of equal policy for everybody. So it remained as it is, making the Malay community became the majority, and the blueprint is a for majoritarian rule. So why I mentioned 1980s Islamization projects that happened back then in the reign of our Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir, with the co-optation of our current Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, the Islamization policy making the Malay Islam supremacy become bolder. It become the policies, and what happened is that to the race and ethnic relation between the Chinese, the Malay, the non-Muslims, become easily strained, because in our policies, in our constitution, you put Islam at the top, and somehow right now, fast forward 40 years later, we are seeing that the narratives of Malay Islam supremacy is like toppling everything. So right now, even though when current government led by Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim is trying to bring Malaysia to a more moderate Muslim country, they couldn't backtrack to, to make Malaysia become what it used to be back in the 1970s, where, Malay, Chinese, and Indians having more harmonious relation among themselves. Because bureaucracy, especially Islam, when it's bureaucratized, as what Dr. Mazda Muhammad said, when you start a religious bureaucracy, it becomes bigger and bigger, because bureaucracy by its nature is growing. It cannot, it cannot be small, and it cannot be smaller. And so what we are seeing is that the National Religious Department in Malaysia, before this it was just a unit. Now it became its own, ministry somehow, and it oversees other ministries that is controlling others. So that's already the blueprint, because why? It touched on every level or every aspect of our social relations. For example, the social relation between how the relation between non-Muslims and Muslim are being governed. We have a guideline from the Ministry of Religious Department saying that if non-Muslim wants to invite Muslim to religious event, then there must be certain guidelines. For example, we cannot have the symbol shown, we cannot have this, statues inside of the place. So it become bolder and bolder. So now we are heading to a majoritarian rule, and when the non-Muslim are feeling threatened, then we are seeing how this polarized view between the majority and the minority becomes, become very divisive. But again, nobody wants to question this blueprint. So it's already a fertile land. So how polarization happened in the sense that because the majority feel threatened and they become entitled, so we're seeing the hateful conversation right now is easily engineered and manufactured. So in Malaysia, the situation is like very bad, as in every single thing can spark hateful narratives, and not just that, hate is engineered and manufactured on a daily basis by various actors. That includes the government.
Great, thank you very much. So, going to the next question. We now know that polarization concerns the clustering of society, and that there is resentment, that there is probably anger and phobia, and this development of us and them mentality. But what are the forms and manifestations of polarization? What's the most visible form of polarization? Is it more socio-economic? Is it more ethno-religious, in the case of Malaysia, for instance? Is it environmental issues? Is it religion? What's your take?
Thank you. Well, maybe I will answer that question with an example. We can trace back political polarization from our early ages as a republic, from the independence in general. We could see really early in the in the 1900s, 1800s, sorry, that there was a big fight between centralists and federalists, people who were in favor centralism and people who were against it, you know. There was a big division and polarization about centralism and federalism. Later on, in the 1900s, we had a really big peak of violence between liberals and conservative parties too, who started a war for power, leading to a period of time that was called La Violencia, that literally translates the violence. And right now, currently, the situation in Colombia, it's about understanding what has happened throughout 60 years of war in the country, with almost 9 million of victims throughout these 60 years of war. At this point, there is a big debate and a polarization debate around mostly 4 questions in general. First of all is who is accountable and who has been responsible in general. Second, who are the victims and why they are victims. And third is what are the measures we should address in order to stop violence and war in general in the country. Those are big questions that have generated a lot of debate in a really political divisions. And maybe you are familiar a little bit with this, but in 2016, the government find or reach a peace agreement with the oldest guerrilla of the hemisphere, the FARC, F-A-R-C, FARC. And we were able, or the government put in place a referendum, a plebiscite, for the population to vote in favor or against this peace agreement. You can imagine that everyone started to be in divide on what they should vote, you know. Families were totally polarized. The debate in general was really, really divided. My family in general was against and some of them were in favor. It was a really tough moment. At the end, the plebiscite didn't win, so the people who were against won, but for just 1%. And at the end, the question in general, or this big concept of political polarization based on our experience in Colombia can lead us to 2 main conclusions that we have been developing or at least deepening at the Institute for Integrated Transitions. First of all is that elections in general are fertile ground for polarization. That's important. This is a context, or electoral processes is a really competitive process that exacerbates polarization in general, and it's in these particular moments where preventive action is needed to contain polarization, but not to do like sustainable and interventions. We need to go through this electoral process. So electoral processes are fertile ground for polarization. And secondly, the Colombian context show us also that we have been immersed in this discussion about who is responsible of the conflict, about understanding the conflict dynamics and the violent dynamics in general. But that has not allowed us to go deeper into try to understand, or at least address, the deeper and more structural problems that we have in our society. For example, inequity, poverty in general, which reaffirms the idea that I posed initially, that polarization is a hyper problem that makes more difficult to at least think and solve other structural problems, as it is happening right now in Colombia. So in order to be more brief and simplify my answer is that it could be all of those, and it's mostly about prominent clustering topics that generate division and polls it creates a thinking of us versus them, of othering in general. And it could be alongside political, religious, environmental issues, among others.
Okay, so this is quite a contentious issue. So elections are fertile ground for polarization. But elections are necessary. Rotating governments are necessary in democracies. So perhaps there is a need for some level of polarization. Maybe there is good in polarization, right? Otherwise, then we'll be having a catch-all parties and everyone being in the middle without having any sort of serious debate on what's best for public policy, right? So maybe some level of polarization is necessary, but then to what extent does that polarization becomes severe or pernicious or toxic? I guess that's the main issue. Do you agree, Anna?
Yes, I totally agree. I started talking a little bit about that in terms of the radicalization of politics. So I want to, thinking about Brazil and the form of polarization we see most glaring in our context, of course I could answer like Daniel started. In our society in Brazil, as Colombia is a very unequal inequality in Brazil is huge, either racial inequality, gender inequality, income inequality. But I want to stress on the focus on what's new in Brazil nowadays in terms of the radicalization of politics, and new in a sense of divisions and differences among elections we always had. We had different polls, left, right, center right in Brazil. And so what I want to comment a little bit more is political polarization transferring its radicalization to different layers in the Brazilian society, and religion being used as a tool to radicalize way much stronger one pole of the Brazilian political spectrum. So that is the new thing of the Brazilian context. Religion seems to one important thing to have you all informed about Brazil. Brazil is a secular state since the 1800s, and Brazil respects and recognizes all the religions. It doesn't have a official religion, and Brazil is mostly Christian, Catholic, and Protestants. So almost 9% of Brazilians are either Catholics or Protestants. And this is new because before the majority were Catholic, but now we have like 56 Catholics and 34% Protestants in Brazil, and the rest of the percentage in different religions. So, but religion in politics, being mobilized in politics, is really, and in this scale that we see today, is new. So, at the same time, in terms of whether the influence of religion in public life and political life is a good or a negative thing, Brazilian society is divided today. Significant cleavages have been built between evangelicals and Catholics, and people with other religious affiliations or not religion at all. There is also an important division in Brazilian society between those who agree and disagree that the federal government should promote specific Christian moral values in politics today. But it's everything about religion? I would say no. Most of it's about political polarization and the use of religion for specific political purposes by certain political forces. What we see in Brazil today is not an indiscriminate invasion of religion in politics. We are actually witnessing a systematic, radical, and instrumental incorporation of religion, or of a certain conception of religion, and especially certain Christian values, by one political pole. An anti-democratic, far-right political pole is increasing its influence in Brazilian politics, and I believe in other countries as well. And here I'm not talking about Christian values based in solidarity or community or social justice, nor universal human rights. So in terms of democratic principles and threats to a plural democracy in Brazil, what's happening? We are talking about politicians using certain religions, leaders, and narratives, and at the same time, what I call religious businessmen, among, I don't know how to say it, using the institutional political environment, a more polarized one, to increase their influence and therefore their religious corporations. Brazilian population, as I said, has been dealing with different social, economic, and public security crises for several years. And not only Brazil is facing those crises. And the far-right political forces are the ones most mobilizing religion in specific ways when dealing with people's daily and concrete challenges within this social, economic, and urban security crisis. So in this context, politicians in Brazil today, religious ones or not, have been mobilizing religions and its more individualistic and dogmatic contemporary forms as a way to offer alternatives for restoring order, predictability, security, and unity. So that's what we are facing right now.
I think in Indonesia, we can also see this phenomenon of the politicization of religion. Of course, during election times, that usually increases and enhanced during campaigns. Now, Nick, as you respond, can you also sort of perhaps reflect on the differences between the global south and the global north in terms of polarization? I mean, if you look at Edelman's chart on polarization, it seems that, you know, you have the US there, you have Colombia there, you have, you know, so it's a mixture of groups of countries, both democratic and non-democratic, global north and global south. And it seems like polarization, or democracy in that sense, has no direct correlation in terms of the level of polarization, both in the global north and global south. I mean, what's happening in the US right now, in the UK, in most of Europe, we see a lot of polarization, but similarly in many global south countries. So is there a difference, do you think? I mean, with more established democracies and elections, you know, for hundreds of years, but yet we're still seeing polarization?
Well, these are nice questions. I'm going to ask for your patience to make more distinctions, because we've already heard some really important ones, and I also want to talk about the British Empire. Partly because, and this is very important to understand for Indonesian students, if you are an English school child and you are studying history, you will never discover that the British had an empire. It's almost impossible to discover this, and if you were to discover it, you would certainly not hear about Malaysia. So this is very important to realize that the teaching of history is crucial to this. So the two distinctions I want to make, the first is between ethnicity and religion, and the second is between nation states and cities. So Padiki, you already introduced an important distinction, and it was very relaxed, just in passing, which is that we are meeting in Jogja, and I am a professor in a university in Birmingham. Now, this is a very different way of introducing ourselves than saying, you are an Indonesian intellectual and I'm a British intellectual. Because if you concentrate on nation states and talk about Colombia and Brazil and Malaysia and Britain, you get a very particular kind of discussion. And you also introduced the importance of looking at maps, Padaki. The British Empire loved maps. But maps are not found, they are made. And it's very important for us to realize that we're not just looking at phenomena which exist in the world, we're looking at phenomena which are being produced. So my first encouragement to us is, if we want to make sense of polarization, if we think at the level of cities, it will be much easier to think about practical action, cooperation, and forms of change that we can participate, even democratically, Whereas if we think at the level of nation states, or even at the level of global north and global south, we will become slightly incapacitated. We will feel unable to make much of a sense of how we can change things. The second distinction is between ethnicity and religion. So, Noor Hadi, you said, again, it was very relaxed and in passing, that the British imperial forces in Malaysia discovered very early on that it was to our advantage to distinguish between Malay, Indian, and Chinese population. And if you looked at the Dutch imperial forces in Indonesia, you'd also want to find out how they classified different ethnic groups. But things change. Now, you also said in passing, the distinction is less between Malay, Indian, and Chinese. It's also between Muslims and non-Muslims. Now, the classifications at work here, are we dealing with ethnic groups? Are we dealing with religious groups? Why is there a shift from ethnic discussion to religious discussion? And I think the answer has to be someone is benefiting from that change. Elections are necessary in a democracy. They're always imperfect. I think Churchill said democracy is absolutely the worst form of political governance, except for all of the others that have been tried from time to time. So it is necessary to have elections. Polarization only becomes a significant force in elections when it can be used to advantage. And in that case, the question of toxicity or non-toxicity becomes less important than who is benefiting and how coalitions are formed. The British nation state has a very strange form of political governance in which we do not have majoritarian rule. We have a very, very odd system. You can ask me about it later, how ours works. Whereas if you went to Germany, for example, you have a federal republic with much more tendency towards majoritarian discussions because it's much more localized. So my encouragement for us is to be very suspicious and very intellectually productive in asking what is the difference between thinking about nation states and thinking about cities, and what is at stake if we think about ethnicity or we think about religious polarization. So those are my two philosophical gifts for our discussion today.
Now, Noor Huda, you brought up this idea about history, and of course, during the 17th, 18th century, the British were trying to get the natives to work for them, but obviously they found them to be lazy, and because of that, they had to import cheap labor from India and China, and hence you do find that sort of MCIO formula sort of almost being permanent and stable. But that also sort of established the division of labor in society, right? Where the Malays became, government officers in bureaucracy, and the Chinese working in industries and extractive industries, distribution, and then the Indians working in the plantations, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the Alibaba enterprise, where the Malay bourgeoisies will be getting government contracts and then subcontracting it to the Chinese to do the work, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's almost permanent. The polarization in Malaysia is almost permanent and stable. And, of course, during the tenure of the Barisan Nasional, UMNO at the helm, and MCA and MIC, but now we're seeing a different kind of Malaysia. I mean, or are we not seeing a different kind of Malaysia? Can we be hopeful of Malaysia?
You're asking whether it's hopeful or not?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, but before that, I need to respond to Nick first, where how does that race, Malay, become Muslim? Well, actually, in the consciousness of the Islamists in Malaysia, because we have to admit, Islamism has been part and parcel of the Malay politics. We have Islamist political party, we have, I think, one or two, and then there are also Islamists across Malay political parties, yeah? So how does Malay become Muslim is the narrative of these Islamists seeing, actually when the Malays reign supreme, is the Islam reigning supreme. Now, partly is because of the fault of the British colonizers when they wanted to define what is Malay in the constitution. So Malay before this is like just the Malay land. Whoever comes to the Malay land, they become Melanized. Who come to Jawa, they become Javanized. Yeah, it was very fluid identity in this Nusantara, you know. So what happened when during the colonization is that because one thing that I observe about the Western world is that they love demarcating things, defining things, right? I mean, that kind of mindset, when they wanted to draft our constitution, they defined what is Malay. So this is where the mistake come from. I mean, that is also because of the way how Westerners think, but it seeped into our consciousness and shape even the Malays, how they define themselves. Who are the Malays? They must be Muslim, practicing Islam, practicing the Malay norms and tradition. So right now in Malaysia, Malays in Malaysia is unlike Malays in Indonesia. When Malays in Indonesia, they can actually, you know, convert to Christianity without any problem, without legal problem. But in Malaysia, it's like, you know, it's a no-no. In our policies, there's no laws that allows Muslim to convert out. So Islam has been part and parcel of that definition of Malays. So what happened in terms of politics? It becomes more and more. Now when Islamists come into the picture, it's the supremacy of Islam. Now it's a combined or the hybrid between the Malay politics and the Islamist politics is become Malay Islamic supremacy. Before this, we couldn't imagine that because in Barisan National Times back then, 1990s, before 2000, right? The imagination was that Malay politics is Malay politics. But of course, Islam has been part and parcel in our life. But because of this contestation, who are more Islamic among the Malays, so that is why the Islamization project comes in and then therefore galvanize the Islam part in the Malayness. So that's what happened. Going back to the question again, Pak Diki, what was it? Yeah. I'm not seeing any hope in, better hope. In Malaysia, I'm very pessimistic because I came from that background of, understanding the Islamist politics and the way how right now, as what my supervisor, Dr. Waiwen, would say, that the values of Islamism is like become fluid. Now is the phase of fluid Islamism where the values of that supremacy of Islam in political life, in social life, is very embedded in our Malay society. So because of that, right, what happened is that now we are seeing the rise of the middle class, but it's also the rise of modern conservatism. Modern conservatism is like, people always assume that conservatives are those who are coming from the rural areas. But what they don't realize is that the rural areas, the rural people or the kampong people are much more tolerant with each other. Chinese, Malay and Indian, if they live in the kampong, in the villages, they are much more tolerant with each other. They don't see differences so much, and don't feel hateful towards each other. And we see that in states like that is not so urbanized, like in Perak, in other areas where it's not very urbanized setting, what happened is that they can go to any food, how do I say this, restaurants that is, owned by non-Muslims, the Chinese, the Indians, the Malay can just come and go, still can get halal food, and nobody would question the halalness of this food. But again, in KL, it's different. It's like everybody was like obsessed. Is this halal or not? Is this halal or not, right? And then we have also players who would, mention in the social media, this restaurant is like, don't have halal certificate, and it's easy, like, would rupture people to like, okay, that's where the hateful narratives come in and whatnot. So the thing is, with the rise of Islamist politics in Malaysia right now, what we call green wave in the last election, which we have predicted by before 2022 election, people thought that, oh, it's the fault of the people in the rural area in Kelantan, in Terengganu and whatnot. But what they did not realize is that it's coming from the KLite or the KL people coming back to Kelantan, to Terengganu, and give votes to the Islamists. So it's something that, I mean, this assumption need to change, that the politicization of religion is not coming from those who are in the rural areas. It's coming from the urban people.
Mark Friedman talks about the ambiguities of polarization, and one of the ambiguities is the rural-urban ambiguity as well, because you see different kinds of dynamics. And then Nick also mentioned the city level, and perhaps there are also provincial and national level polarization. Please.
So you mentioned cities, and I wanted to make cities an important thing. I would say that one of the slogans for our Unconference could be "Hope is in cities." That's where to find hope. And just to give an example of Jogja, I hope you will have many guests who come to Jogja for at least two reasons. The first is that ICRS, which is going to be 20 years old next year, is a consortium between a non-religious aligned university, UGM, a Christian university, Duta Wacana, and one of the UENs, one of the Islamic universities, Sunan Kalijaga. 20 years old collaboration between very, very strongly religious institutions and then a non-religious institution. And it happens in Jogja. Now, if you said, is there one in Jakarta? No. Is there one anywhere else in ASEAN? No. Is there anyone like that anywhere in the world? Actually, no. It's the only one that I know of where this kind of collaboration is possible. And it's possible because of particular people 25 years ago who decided to have a vision for collaboration of this kind at a city level. Tomorrow, you're going to hear from a very extraordinary person, Ibu Elga Sarapong with Interfidi, also based here in Jogja, which is a collaboration between different religious traditions, and they have a program for students to visit different religious sites as part of their university education. That sort of city-based activity, shaping the minds and the imaginations of the young, who will then go on to be voters and activists, these are where forms of hope reside. So yes, my slogan for us is "Hope is in cities."
Can I build on that?
Sure. And while you're responding to that, we might also have to go into the solution spectrums. I mean, how do we deal with polarization? You know, Mark Friedman talks about the three solution spectrums. One is the outreach dialogue, second one is the narrative and the storytelling, and the third one is institutional reform, or legal and policy reform. So if you can also tie that into the possible solution spectrums, and perhaps even the actors who might be involved. Because some people say, oh, the state should not be involved, but then, you know, the state is sometimes part of the problem.
Of course.
You know, and of course sometimes they're part of the solution, but for the most part, I think the state has become part of the problem.
Yes, and I want to build on that. I believe the state is part of the problem, but also part of the solution. It must be part of the solution because the scale and the power the state has locally, nationally, regionally. But I want to build on that because I was talking about a certain new ways of division or trying to divide the Brazilian society nowadays, right? But what we are seeing now also as a response to that is that locally people cooperate more than divide themselves. Even families, especially women, and because Brazil, as in many global south countries, women are responsible for households, for the houses, are the main responsible people for the houses and for taking care of children, for the families. And the idea of family is really important in Brazilian society right now. And those women locally and those families locally, they cooperate more than stress their divisions or their differences, either background differences or beliefs differences or religious differences. So they face the same challenges at a local level. I would say city level, but local, really local level. So what we see now is that the question is, as you said, who profits from the polarization? So which actors, because the state also is heterogeneous. Who is in the state? Who's running the state? Who profits from a greater polarization and who doesn't profit from greater polarization? So what we see is that in Brazil today, whether at local level or national level, the state policies or public policies that are open to listen and to incorporate more the different ways people are dealing with their social and economic crisis locally, are managing better to mitigate political polarization and radicalization, as I mentioned before. So what I'm trying to say is that the state has a big role, but the answers are coming from the ground.
Maybe I want to expand a little bit more on that question, and it's mostly, first of all, the ambiguity. I really like what you propose. There is an ambiguity and a dilemma around polarization, whether polarization is permanent or is temporal. That's a dilemma and a debate that we need to address. What I mean about permanent is that it's the idea that polarization will always exist, but it will differentiate in terms of intensity, in levels of intensity. Do we have more or less polarization? First proposal. The second is the ambiguity. The second term is that it is temporal. That definitely polarization can be ended, right? Based political in the political science field, democracies are based on dissensus in debate in general. So maybe they will be more inclined to say that it's permanent, but in different levels, right? And in terms of democracies really grow and strengthen in this idea of finding dissensus on debate in general, on discussion, on putting together different perspectives, and to find consensus in general and agreement. That's like a general political science premise. Being said that, definitely polarization does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs definitely in a set or an ecosystem of social norms, rules, and institutions. That's also something we need to understand and recognize. Being said that is how we can reshape these discussions and how we can reshape the narratives and the institutions that are involving or framing polarization in general terms. And as you were mentioning, in our research at IFIT, at the Institute for Integrated Transitions, we have proposed a series of maybe elements that could address at some level polarization, and I would like to share it with you. First of all, institutional and political reforms are really important, and I can share a little bit more on that with some examples, particularly from Colombia. Second, peaceful demonstrations and definitely civic engagements. It's really important, and I will address that point in a few minutes. Active involvement of young people, that's really important. Our research have shown, research in Colombia, also in Tunisia, and in the Middle East have shown that young people are have less fixed positions, which allow precisely dissensus and understanding. Also spaces for dialogue and consensus building. Most of the interventions that we can find in literature to address this kind of problems and intergroup conflict in general are mostly based in dialogue, dialogue, negotiation, mediation, and facilitation. Definitely, narrative work is another element that could help depolarize, as we can recognize negative and positive narratives that we create to the other in general. And another thing is trust-building generation, as part of this idea of reducing the gap between the poles. The problem, particularly in democracies where polarization becomes toxic, is when the poles, right, the two main parties break the bridge that connects them, you know? And they just start reinforcing their own narratives and their own imaginaries around the other, and who is the other, and the fear that it causes the other in general. And we have a lot of examples of that in Latin America. So those, it's like a general frameworks of how to address polarization. But maybe I would like one more second to address your question, who is responsible then to address polarization? And the simple question will be, it's everyone's job, right? It's not only the government's job, it's everyone's job. At IFIT, we have proposed and put special emphasis on what we have called norm keepers. What is a norm keeper? People, in general, who can elevate their voices and who can speak up and show what polarization is in a particular society. These people, norm keepers, are mostly religious leaders, celebrities, social leaders in general, business leaders, actors, etc., who can elevate the discussion, who can elevate the qualification of the debate in general, who can also speak up and show where polarization is, and who can also pressure decision makers to act. That's really important. Yet, we have recognized that when this happens, these people who have the courage to speak up have security issues, right? They, as it happens in Colombia, are more proclive to get threatened or to even get killed, you know? So another measure to address polarization is to protect, in fact, the norm keepers. In Colombia, there has been a systematic killing of social leaders that have to speak on human rights, environmental issues, etc., topics that really generate polarization. So those is a general framework of maybe to address the question who and how we can address polarization.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So I'd like to now invite the audience members, if you have any comments, questions, or remarks, please make them fast and furious. We have about maybe another 12 minutes or 13 minutes. So please put your hands up, and please, will somebody provide a microphone for anyone? Anybody? Questions, comments, or clarifications? Yes. At the back? At the back there. Who else? And then 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Please stand up, please, and identify yourself.
Okay, good morning. My name is Sipianus Lidik Ismantro Putro. I'm from Rafindo, Masyarakat Anti Fitnah Indonesia. And pardon if I not really understand what, because I'm a little bit late, but I want to say about this one. We have a tendency to think that religion are always investing good to the society. But when religion meet politics, we forget that democracy itself have its own values. So what I feel in the global south, not only south, but also in global political level, there is not enough investigation from the democracy to religion. So we don't play this like something that reciprocally connecting between religion and democracy. So I think we have to drive back this tendency from religion to politics. So the politic and the democracy have to invest to religion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The next one, please. Professor Michael Northcott.
Because I was a professor, so I don't always, oh, it's working. So, I think the question who benefits is very interesting. The British Empire made money from polarization. It benefited. So the question to the panel is, who is now making money from promoting polarization? From my perspective, Just to give one example, the United States has been massively divided by a series of largely fake divide and rule issues. And the people who benefit are people who benefit from social unrest. Security companies, private and public intelligence agencies, the media, ultimately the people who write contracts for security agencies, and the rest, who of course are often banks. Sometimes we call them banksters. Anyway, I shouldn't answer my own question, but Nick is right. The British Empire benefited from we called it divide and rule, right? Who now benefits? That's my question to the panel.
Thank you very much. We have another question at the back. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Agus from Satyawacana Christian University. In my opinion, there are many polarization. For example, there is political polarization. That we know that democracy tend to be majoritarianism and also despotism. I want to know your opinion, Daniel, that you say that we have to maybe reform the democracy, but we know that now democracy is tend to be majoritarianism and also despotism. I'm back to there are many polarization, political polarization, and also economic polarization and environment polarization. For example, in Indonesia, there is conflict between local government and local people about adat land, and sometimes also with company with local people. Also, there is polarization in education, religion polarization. So, which one most important to address? Political polarization or others? So that other polarization can reduce when the most polarization it can overcome. Thank you.
Okay, David, please. One more. One last question. Yes. And one more. Okay, yeah, please make it quick. No, here, please. Yeah.
Hello, yes, I'm David Cheetham from the University of Birmingham, and what occurs to me is I'm a leader of a faculty that has a department of philosophy in it. And I just heard in the back of my mind, because some of my philosophers' colleagues are very analytic in philosophy, so there's different kinds of philosophy, continental, indigenous, and analytic philosophers. And I suppose that our friend up there, Nick, is very good at clarifying things, but they would say that they would associate polarization with clarification. They would see things in terms of binary thinking about either or, it's either this or it's that. And I wondered if one of the challenges conceptually of polarization is what we're looking at are we diversifying viewpoints? Is that part of the solution of saying that there are many sides to particular questions or solutions? Or, how do we then address the philosophical sort of privilege of analytic thinking of binary thought between either or? Is that also part of the problem here as well? But that's just a thought that occurred to me in the back of my mind, hearing my colleagues in the back of my mind from the philosophy department. Yeah.
All right, one more, please. A very quick one. We're running out of time, apparently.
I'll try to make it very quick. My name is Andi Andriani. I now based in Pontianak, which is West Kalimantan, and it also suffered from the experience of ethnic/religious conflict. So listening through all of the panels, I wonder, because polarizations, the way it's being discussed, now it seems to have like a more inward looking, and how I understand the extremist movement, particularly in Indonesian context, it's also very linked to the global Islamist movement. So how does it actually work when polarization is actually looked more at a particular setting which actually differentiate a community from the other, distinct it in a very inward-looking kind of sense. How does it actually interlink with the global movement, and how does, like in Malaysian context, how does the government deal with that, you know? And I wonder, actually on Malaysia, for instance, particularly because we are that close, rather than possibly 24 hours flight from Brazil and Colombia, or more even, yeah. I wonder how do the government in Malaysia utilizing Islamization to convert other ethnicities, and how they position them, and that, like the non-Malay Muslim, the Chinese Muslim, the Indian Muslim, and how do they themselves position themselves in the polarized society. But the way that Anna put it, I wonder whether this connection is also a characteristic of polarization, if Daniel was talking about ambiguity and temporary, because it feels like it is so disconnect between the macro level with the local women, family, you know, like the things that you elaborated. And I also wonder whether there are also contradiction in the features of polarization, because Nick, you also mentioned that, well, people can actually work together when it comes to the rubbish in Birmingham, and interest can be very fluid. It is also manufactured, so they might actually have the contradiction themselves. And if we can dismantle this contradiction, or if we can identify this contradiction, maybe we will find also a new opportunities in handling the polarization itself. So I put it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 5 questions, 5 comments and clarification. I'll provide maybe 2 minutes each for the panelists to respond to any of the questions or comments. Anna, would you like to start?
Yes. I'm not necessarily answering all of them, but like in general, first of all, who benefits? Well, I come from a colonized country, so it's a different way to answer this question when you come from a colonized country than when we are an empire. But what I don't want to pose the question nor the answer in these terms. I want to look at Brazil and see who benefits from this stressing polarization and this more radical, as I said and stressed on all my answers of political radicalization, is that those who doesn't want to share power in any dimension, in the state level, in a family level, in institutional level. So those who want to keep themselves in power in a way of saying that it's a more radical world in many terms. So if we stay here, we're gonna manage this. If we stay here, we're gonna keep you safe. Or if we move, if we change, if we bring different people, different profiles, different movements, in any kind, in order to change this, the world, your life, your institution, your school, your church are going to be messier. So I want to leave this reflection to us. Who benefits? Who doesn't want to share power concretely? And democracy and religion, I didn't have time to work on that, and I have this pamphlet on our work. We do it based back in Brazil, so if you can look at, because we work a lot with different religious groups and democracy, because when you're talking about faith, religious groups, religious community, we are also talking about community, belonging, solidarity, cooperation. So I think what's a pity in Brazil today is that some specific religious groups are being mobilized to radicalize more politics, as I said, but at the same time, these same actors, religious groups and movements are important actors in order to mitigate that. And someone asked about the dimensions, like if we could choose a better or a hierarchy of which dimension face first, political, socially, locally, environmental. We cannot. I think it's a that's the tricky thing. It's a multi-dimensional way of looking at polarization and mitigating that. And to finish, that's why, especially in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, I think I don't love the idea that we talk about only polarization all the time, because I think we in a sense of, as I started commenting on the way of the central will not hold, the center will not hold, we need to put our differences on the table. We need to listen to who disagree with us. It's not only to talk about polarization all the time, or in general terms, sometimes doesn't allow us to concretely deal with our differences. And I don't believe, and we don't believe in Brazil, that necessarily denying the conflicts that exist, denying the differences that we want them to exist. It's a way of facing polarization.
Thank you, Anna.
Maybe I can answer the one question around political representation in general, and I will share with you maybe a paradox that it's based on the Colombian context, and this is really philosophical. The way we have handled polarization and political polarization in Colombia is by including more viewpoints into the spectrum and the realm, right? So the polarization has happened, at least in Colombia, because of the lack of political inclusion in the representative institutions such as Congress or electoral process in general. So some of the structural reforms that we have put in place in order to deal with polarization is in fact open the electoral system for more parties to participate in the electoral process. So they can in fact participate and share their perspectives. There were two big reforms in 1991 and later on in 2003 that opened the perspectives and dismantled the bipartisan political system or partition system that was in place in Colombia. So in order to address polarization, it's about our political polarization, at least in Colombia. It has helped to include more viewpoints into the spectrum, but not only that, it's also about creating the conditions for these different viewpoints to keep in touch and to keep dialogue and to keep connected. So it's a how, so it's a question about process too. It's about institutions, so people can, so parties, actors, poles can continue being connected. What we don't want in terms of polarization, again, is to create this othering thinking of us versus them. So in order to do that, we need to create the correct process, the correct institutions for these actors to continue dialoguing, cooperating, in fact, criticizing between each other, you know? Dialogue is the formula to not create radical polarization in general.
Okay, thank you very much. Nurhuda, maybe? And I'll give it to Nick, last opportunity. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. So I'm going to address most of the questions bit by bit, yeah? Now, we're talking about which intervention point that we should do our intervention. We look into the context. From Malaysia context, since religion is become very pervasive, so I'm seeing that religion is a very important intervention point, where our religious education, as our brother mentioned here, is the lack of the democratic values or democracy conversation within the religious discourse. So what happened was that in Malaysia, the conversation about what Islam in democracy and how democracy in Islam, when there are progressive groups want to bring that conversation in, what happened is that conversation will be clamped down. So culturally, socially, politically and even systematically our, places where dialogues and diversifying viewpoints should be nurtured is not there actually, because our institution, our laws, our governments are not looking at that at a very positive, understanding of positive mindset. Partly it's because of that is the way how Malay feudalism is inside our political system or our governance. I would call it as an extension of modern feudalism, which we had not yet delved into it. But what we are seeing right now, our government, is that behaving the same like our sultans, our rulers, our traditional rulers. Now, going back to who benefits from this polarization, definitely our rulers, our traditionals. We have 9 sultans in Malaysia, actually the most in the world. One country we have 9 sultans. We have 9 states who have these rulers without, with political immunity, in which that the thing is that when Malaysia wants, the Malay land want to gain independence from the British Empire, is that even some of the rulers doesn't want that independence. Why? Because they benefit from the British empires in terms of monetary benefit, right? So when the independents want to be, the British empires, okay, we let you go, we give you your sovereignty, but our rulers themselves do not want that. Because why? Because they wouldn't get money from the British colonizers. So they say like, okay, this is not beneficial for us, but it's not beneficial for them, not for the rakyat. So now our government, so this second beneficiaries, global context. So the thing is that global context, if I wanted to draw from the current development of how Malay Islam supremacy politics become very pervasive in Malaysia, is because there is this group of Islamists, the most far right, the most radical one, is actually co-opting the Ikhwan al-Muslimin ideas of politics where Arab-Islam unity, but it's a bastardized version of it. So they're seeing that since because of that definition, Malay and Islam is very, very solidified. So what happened is that if we want Islam to reign, then the Malay has to reign. So that's the idea. So right now what we are seeing is that even the UMNO, the Barisan Nasional, for the first time in the 2000 plus, we are seeing how this UMNO and also PAS can sit together. So it's become Malay politics and Islamist politics is combined together. So it's actually a hybrid because of these imported ideas of Islamic Arab unity, but it's a bastardized version. Now, in the context of how Islam actually gives a problem to bureaucratize Islam, give heightened problem to polarization, is because the definition of Malay, again, who are they who are embracing Islam or converting to Islam? So once non-Malays, Chinese, Indians, or other ethnicities converted into Islam, they got the Malay privileges. So it's social and economic as well.
Thank you very much. This is coming from a scholar of Arabic literature from the International Islamic University, by the way. Nick, no, just give your final say.
2 things. If, like me, you think that cities are where hope lies, then we need to be very careful, because the political scientists will encourage us to think about nation states, and the anthropologists will encourage us to think about very local communities. But we need to resist both of these and say we need to think about cities, which is neither nation states nor very local communities. We need to have forms of religious studies research, which is very city-based. The second question about who benefits. The number 1 priority for most ruling elites is how do you persuade people to vote for a party who will make them poorer? And religion is the most unlikely source for this, because of course the one thing that the religious traditions teach us is do not be greedy and look after the poor. So the most remarkable development of all, I think, is the use of religious polarization to persuade us to vote for parties who will make us poorer.
All right, let's give everyone a round of applause. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I sincerely thank all of you for your participation and kind attention. So I will now give it back to the MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, big applause for our panels. We kindly ask speakers to remain seated because we prepare a short ceremony for token of appreciation led by our moderator. Okay, thank you very much for our speaker for the insightful contribution. You may now return to your seat as we continue our program.